My HS 103 students, it's your Professor Donald Earl Collins. It is now week seven in the course. Your writing assignment is due this week. Your final draft is due this week, and I'll talk to you briefly more about that. I'll talk to you also about where we are in this week in this course, which is the U.S. Finally growing into a superpower, basically a late teenage stage based version of Superman with nuclear weapons and a winning army and a large navy and a huge air force and so on and so forth. Yay! Largest economy in the world. First among equals, right? Creator of the United Nations and so on and so forth. America, pretty much, this period is the start of the true start of what we understand among historians to be the American century. Pax Americana and all of that, and the period after World War II, of course. So um, that's, maybe there's a little bit of tongue in cheekness in there, maybe there's a little bit of sarcasm in there, but it's also facts, right? These are things that happen. So um, let's just cover a couple of things real quick before I go into summarizing the main themes of the week, which is this. I'm kind of surprised by some of the questions I've been getting over the past week from students about different things. The Moodle questions don't surprise me. Moodle's very difficult to work with. It's only allowing me to open up one section of things at a time, but won't let me do everything at once. And as a result, some students are further ahead than others. Some students are waiting to the last minute to do stuff. Some students are waiting so late to do stuff that I can't really distribute what they've got at all. That kind of thing. And so as a result, the result is I've gotten a lot of questions, some of which I understand, but some of which I don't. Right? I don't understand the question that's essentially that if you don't have a student to review, what are you supposed to do in that particular case? And I indirectly I addressed it in a class on Thursday. I kind of addressed it a little bit last week, but I also um, also assumed that it's pretty self-explanatory. If 20 to 25% of the students in your class have not submitted a paper, have not submitted their first draft of their essay, their writing assignment, then by definition that means if you're one of those 25% who don't have a writing assignment to review, that means you don't have anything to review, and that's that. You don't get a zero. Why would I give you a zero for that? You don't get a grade for it at all, really. And that's my intent. I was thinking at one point maybe a 9 out of 10 for everybody who did it, but that doesn't seem right at all because you're not actually doing the work. So the best thing to do is to basically say that you don't get a grade on it. I mean, there's no grade. That means it doesn't impact your grade at all. It's like you have one less thing to do. That's all, right? So your life's a little bit easier in that sense. But you don't get there's no advantage or disadvantage because of that, right? You just aren't graded on it. It's that simple. So it doesn't impact your grade at all. There's nothing to worry about in that regard. For those of you who are doing reviews, you'll get a grade. For those of you who submitted your assignments in your first draft in a relatively timely manner and to the point where someone could review it, well, I account for that somewhere in your discussion grade for weeks 4 through 6. For those of you who still have yet to submit or submitted so late that it just didn't make sense for me to give it to someone and expect them to review it on time, today, right? Then your discussion grade drops. Your discussion grade drops. Your discussion grade drops completely if you didn't submit anything at all. And some of you haven't submitted anything at all. And some of you have not contacted me to say, oh, I can't do it because of X, Y, and Z. And some of you have just decided that you don't need to do it. Fine, don't do it. That's part of your participation grade. You decide not to participate in this task, you will get a lower grade. It's that simple. And some of you in the U.S. side of things, have missed are really already nearing your limit. We're about to hit class meetings 12 and 13 this week, and some of you are already at 5 and 6 absences for the course. Um, Not even counting the first week when we're doing ad drop. In some cases, not even counting week 2. So, because some of you have not shown up for hardly any classes at all. So at a certain point, you need to start taking the course seriously. And so I just want to say this: your final draft is due a week at the end of the week. It's due on Sunday, October the 23rd by 11:59 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time (EDT). If you are even 1 minute late, the system will let me know. And at that point, your highest possible grade on the on assignment is then down to an 89 because you will lose 11 points. I don't care if you're a minute late, an hour late, a day late, 6 days late. You will lose 11 points. Just gone. Just gone. For those of you who need an extension, um, unless there are major extenuating circumstances like you actually have COVID, you're injured in a car accident, you're a family, major injury in a car accident, like you're in the hospital and can't get out. Someone in your family has died, one of your friends has died, has a major illness themselves, and they need your help. Those kinds of things, or some other calamity, unless it's something like that, you have to come to me at least a day in advance. I mean, more than a day in advance, ideally, right? Let me know by Saturday afternoon that you cannot get your assignment done on time, and I might grant you a 3-day extension. Anything after those 3 days is because of major extenuating circumstances. And if you were past those 3 days in terms of getting your assignment done, final draft, your grade will drop. You'll lose 11 points. Simple as that, maybe more. For those who are more than 168 hours late, say you handed in on Monday, October the 31st, you will not get a grade. You'll get a 0. And because this is 45% of your grade, that's a major deal. So I suggest that you get your assignment done. You've had enough time. You've had weeks 4, 5, and 6 to try to figure out what you're doing, to try to write a first draft, to try to review other people's stuff, to try to get a sense of what you're going to do for your final draft. The whole point of this, there are a lot of points to this, but one of them was to make sure that you weren't doing all of this at the last minute, even though about half of you have insisted that the only way you want to operate in your academic life is to do every freaking thing at the last minute. And that's kind of ridiculous when someone's designed a process so that you aren't doing anything at the last minute, that you can do better work. But if you only want to do things in the last minute, then there are going to be some last minute policies available to you in terms of points taken off if you don't get your assignment done. That's all. So that's it. I just want to make sure that's clear. I also need to figure out for this week when I can fit in another film. And I might be able to do something on the Roosevelts on Thursday to make up for the film that I was supposed to show last week, but did not because I canceled classes on Tuesday, since Tuesday afternoon classes are also canceled. So there's that. So anyway, so what I'll do for the next 15, maybe 16 minutes is talk about week 7 lecture, week 7 material. Among Foner's better jobs and Give Me Liberty is what he does with World War II. So a lot of what I'm doing is sort of reiterating what he does in this book. He's stronger as a 20th century historian when it comes to U.S. history in general than and particularly once you get into the 1950s and 60s and 70s, than he is with the early part of the 20th century. I mean, let's face it, the early 20th century is quite boring in terms of U.S. history, unless you like, robber barons and you like the Great Depression and those kinds of things, right? So anyway, that was me being tongue-in-cheek. So here's the thing. World War II, most historians who cover World War II spend a substantial amount of time on the actual theaters of war, right? The European theater of war, the Pacific theater of war, the Asian theater of war, the North African campaign, etc., etc. That is not this class. That is not this class at all. I will not talk to you about battles. Battle of Stalingrad. I'm not going to talk to you. I might talk a little bit about the Holocaust, in terms of, looking at the Cold War and like human rights types of things, but in general, we're not spending time on the war itself because it's the U.S. and there's a lot to cover with the U.S. It's more about how the U.S. gets into the war, what it does during the war, how the U.S. becomes a superpower as a result of the war. So that's where we are this week. And so, real quick, the U.S. was never going to be ready for World War II, ever. Not from the standpoint of dealing with Japanese Empire and its spread into Manchuria in 1931, and eventually into all of the east coast of China during 1937 and 1938, which includes the rape of Nanjing, and the killing and raping of nearly 300,000 people over a 6-week period, sinking of an American destroyer, which killed 50 American sailors, and all of that, right? They were never going to be ready for that. They were never fully ready for what was happening in Europe between Mussolini and Hitler. Um, they were never ready for any of it because the U.S. was in the grips of a Great Depression, and in 10 years before had decided on being an isolationist world power. It reduced its armed forces to 160,000 men serving in the U.S. Army, and maybe about half of that in the Navy, right? Maybe not half, maybe about 2/3 of that in the Navy. Very small forces even agreed to a reduction in the size of its battleships in a series of meetings with the Japanese and the British in 1921 and in 1923. So we couldn't build massive battleships the way the Germans, the British, and the Japanese built. The highest size guns we could build was size 16-inch guns, and we weren't even doing that in the 1920s. So the American commitment to its military was minimal during the 1920s and the early 1930s. Then, as things start heating up in Europe with Hitler militarizing the Ruhr region, the Rhineland region that borders France and Luxembourg and Belgium, with Mussolini's aggressions in Ethiopia and eventually in Libya and northern Africa. With all of that, the U.S. passed a series of laws called the Neutrality Acts. Neutrality Acts in 1935, 1937, and 1939, which is a recommitment to the 35 and 37 Neutrality Acts. Biggest thing here, which is important to understand, which we talked about in class about World War I, is that the U.S. specifically told all of its industries that they would be committing an act of espionage and treason by this law if they were to have any of their company or any of their affiliates involved in weapons making. So that meant divestment for Ford and GM and other corporations from German companies, from British companies, from other places who might be mobilized to actually make weapons, right? So they had to basically cut those folks off. So none of this freelancing that happened during World War I is going to happen during World War II unless the U.S. authorized it. This actually puts the U.S. government squarely, once it does start to mobilize, reliant on these companies to make the weapons. The start of what we now understand to be the military-industrial complex pretty much comes out of the Neutrality Acts indirectly. But the other part, of course, is that the president could not commit the country to any war making. Congress, by Constitution, the Congress had to vote for an act of war anyway. But any deals that the president involved himself in would involve, not doing anything like selling arms or, giving away arms or anything to any countries. That was part of Neutrality Acts as well. When World War II starts, though, FDR recognizes the immediate need for the U.S. to eventually be involved in the war. So he starts authorizing things that are very indirect, like, the Civilian Conservation Corps. They start training with wooden weapons. They start using, like, hey, we're in the forest, let's use some flanking skills and other military tactics to take a flag from the other side of how actually using weapons, because there weren't any guns, machine guns to use, and they couldn't use live ammunition because there weren't enough weapons available for them, just as one example. Um, when he's running for re-election in 1940, he decides to run for an unprecedented third term because he sees that Wendell Willkie, who's his um, who's his opposition in the Republican side, is a pacifist. He's not just an isolationist, he's a full-fledged pacifist. And so, you know, he does things like put the Selective Service Act in place in 1940, not even in 1941, in 1940, in case you might have to be recruited for war. He creates something known as the Lend-Lease Act in 1941 in order to help out the British, because the British are begging the U.S. for anything, you know, 50-year-old destroyers, 25-year-old cruisers, whatever, in order to deal with Nazi German aggression in the Mediterranean, in Northern Africa, in the Atlantic, the patrol for U-boats, and so on and so forth. So he's doing things to try to get the country ready for war, but they're still not ready. More than 80% of the country, on the eve of Pearl Harbor Day, on the eve of this Sunday, December 7th, 1941, something like 87% of the country was anti-war. They did not want the U.S. to go to war. That turns around literally within a 5-hour period in 1941 because of Pearl Harbor. Because the Japanese attacked the U.S. for embargoing oil, rubber, um, steel, and iron ore and other things that they needed for their war economy from them after they invaded French Indochina, which is now Southeast Asia, which of course is Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Um, for their acts of aggression. So they attacked the U.S. before the U.S. could attack them, even though the U.S. wasn't very interested in attacking them at all. There are some historians who believe that FDR let this happen deliberately. Well, there's not enough evidence either way to say that this was definitive or not. That they had the information that Japanese were going to attack the U.S. Navy at Pearl Harbor, and they decided to let them go ahead and do it so that they could get the country to go into war. I don't I wouldn't put it past FDR to have done that, but there's not enough evidence either way to say that he really did it. There's not enough to say that he did it. So I'm erring on the side of an and both. I think they kind of knew something, kind of like the way the Bush administration knew that there would be an attack in and around 9/11 during August of 2001, 2001, but they decided not to do much in terms of action because they got action reports that were similar to that over and over again. They just didn't think they had enough information to act on anything. That makes them sly, but doesn't make them complete, buttheads when it comes to dealing with the security of the nation. So the same thing I think happens in Pearl Harbor's case, or a similar thing. So anyway, U.S. goes to war, mobilizes somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to 16 million men, and quite a few 100,000, more than a million women actually, which aren't accounted for, as part of the war efforts, with 12 million or so men pretty much going overseas in the years between January 1942 until about the summer of 1945. In the meantime, there's two things happening. There's the war front and the needing for food for the war front and the need for weapons for the war front and heating up industries for the front and so on and so forth. So all of that's going on. But there's also stuff going on at the domestic side too, some of which started before the war, like um, A. Philip Randolph, the leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, threatening a march on Washington of 10,000 black men because black men and women were being completely excluded from defense industry work, right? DC's handing out contracts to Ford and GM and DeSoto and all these other companies that make planes and tanks and machine guns and cannon and so on. And black folk in Detroit and in Chicago and in Seattle and in New York or wherever can't get work in any of these. They can't even get housing in these places, right? Because these restrictive covenants saying no Negroes need no Negroes are allowed to live here, and the jobs are saying no Negroes need to apply. And so the threat of the March on Washington led to him, through the help of Eleanor Roosevelt, influencing him to pass pass an executive order known as Executive Order 8802, which specifically forbade these industries that with these government contracts from excluding African Americans from work, or excluding anyone on the basis of race, which meant fines if they did, And sometimes they lost the contract, and sometimes they did lose the contract, and sometimes they were fine, but most of the time they weren't. But it did put a big warning out there saying the federal government is not going to deal with this, not going to deal with this BS around segregation and exclusion during the war effort. On the other hand, on the domestic front, there's also Executive Order 9066, 200 some odd executive orders later, next year in January of 1942, which explicitly allowed the U.S. military to go to Japanese American homes across the West and to intern them into what we call internment camps, basically concentration camps, but not concentration. But they didn't want to use a word like that because concentration camps has very negative connotations. They weren't killing these people; they were just excluding them from the rest of society while taking all their property and businesses and life savings and just dumping them in a camp in the middle of Utah, middle of Arizona, middle of Eastern Washington State and other places. 117,000 Japanese, mostly American citizens, were rounded up in the midst of anti-Japanese hysteria after the attack on Pearl Harbor. This did not happen in Hawaii, where there were nearly 500,000 Japanese living there, which is like nearly 5 times the number of Japanese living in the west coast of the United States. But it didn't happen in Hawaii. They were definitely monitored, but they weren't rounded up. So, interesting contrast in terms of what's happening on the home front. There are also more typical things like meatless Mondays and coffee-free Fridays and sugarless Thursdays and all kinds of other things, and people taking all their scrap metal to be, melted down and used to make weapons, right? So people were sacrificing a lot. But in any case, the the Great Depression was already starting to come to an end in 1941 as FDR is handing out all these defense contracts for to these companies to make planes and tanks and other things. It's also once that happens that you start to see unemployment rate plummet. The unemployment rate, even as late as mid 1941, was still in the teens. It was around 16%, 16, 17%. It drops all the way down basically to zero by the spring of 1942. It's down to basically zero. And so that's what's going on the domestic front. There are all kinds of other things. There's the Zoot Suit riots involving U.S. soldiers and sailors, mostly white, attacking young Mexican American men in Southern California for wearing Zoot suits because it's their symbol of rebellion, right? It's their symbol of we're cool, and the soldiers are like, no, you're not. You're not even patriots. You're not even really, Americans. And so they were attacking these people. This is all happening in the middle of World War II domestically while while the U.S. has become the arsenal for democracy. The bottom line is there's a lot going on. But when the dust settles in 1945, particularly in Europe, and as the U.S. basically renders the Japanese Navy incapable of waging war by the end of 1944, it's fairly obvious the U.S. is the big cheese. It's the major superpower. Along with the Soviet Union, you had to bear the brunt of Nazi Germany's big war machine in 1941 and losing nearly 30 million lives in the process of doing so. But the U.S. is the big cheese in this period. It also develops nuclear weapons, which some historians say help win the war. Most people say, the textbooks basically say that. But the truth of the matter is, without the Soviet Union invading Manchuria and basically grinding down Japanese military of 1.5 million men in a span of like 10 days, that probably helped a little bit too, maybe a little bit more than a little bit, right? We'd rather surrender to the U.S. than do these Russians, who are killing up, 1.5 million troops and capturing, in a span of 10 days. I'm not sure which is more awesome, a couple of atomic bombs or the Soviet, the Red Army in this particular case. So there's that. But anyway, the reason why the U.S. becomes a superpower, besides its huge military industrial might, the ability to supply the Russians with with weapons and food, the ability to supply the British with weapons and food, the ability to supply its own troops with weapons and food, and all of that other stuff, is that so much industrial capacity, particularly in Germany, is destroyed during the war, that by the time the war is over, it's estimated in 1945 that the U.S. economy is generating 52% of the overall GDP of the entire world. The world, not not just compared to other industrial powers, the entire world. We're not even 20% of the world's economy in 2022. If we were operating at 52% of the world's economy today, that means our economy would be generating something like $50 trillion worth of worth, or maybe even 60 trillion. That's a lot. Do you understand how much that is? Right? That economic might, combined with the might of winning, helping in a major way to win the war, across the world, is the reason why the U.S. becomes number one. And that's truly a time, anywhere between, say, May 8th of 1945 through September 2nd of 1945, through the end of the year. If you wanted to chant, "We're number one, USA, USA, USA," that's a perfect time to do it, because you would not be wrong, right? But with that comes brings the U.S. into closer contact with the world, particularly with the Soviet Union, and with different ideologies and ways of thinking about the world that are different from the U.S., which eventually leads to the Cold War, which is basically week 8. So we'll stop here.